Observer Kelthara stood in the transport bay of the diplomatic vessel, adjusting his recording devices for the third time. He had done this work for 200 years, traveling to distant worlds and documenting how different species fought their wars. This assignment was supposed to be simple. The humans were barely 2 centuries into space travel. They were fighting a border dispute with the Krill Dominion, nothing unusual. He would observe, take notes, and file his report 3 weeks at most. The transport docked with the human fleet flagship, a vessel called the UES Defiant. As Kelthara stepped through the airlock, he noticed immediately how crude everything appeared. The metal walls showed welding marks. The gravity fluctuated slightly as he walked. He could hear the hum of machinery that should have been silent. This was primitive technology, the kind most species abandoned centuries ago. She was small by galactic standards, perhaps 1 and 1/2 m tall, with dark hair pulled back from her face. Her uniform was simple cloth rather than adaptive material. She extended her hand in the human greeting gesture. Observer Kelthara, welcome aboard. I'm Lieutenant Maya Brooks, tactical officer. Commander Morrison is waiting in the briefing room. Kelthara studied her carefully. Humans were mammals, warm-blooded and emotional. Their lifespans were remarkably short, barely a century even with their best medicine. Their bodies were fragile, requiring constant food and water. Everything he had read suggested they were at least 500 years behind the Zenthari in technological development. Brooks led him through the ship's corridors. Kelthara counted 17 inefficiencies in the first hallway alone. The lighting was too bright, the air circulation was audible. The communications panels were physical buttons rather than neural interfaces. He made notes on his data pad, barely paying attention to where they walked. They entered the briefing room where a human male sat reviewing holographic displays. He stood when they entered, tall for his species at nearly 2 m. His hair was cut very short and his face showed the lines that humans developed with age and stress. Observer Kelthara, I'm Commander Jake Morrison, thank you for coming aboard. His voice was deep and calm. He gestured to a seat. I hope the accommodations meet your needs. Kelthara settled into the chair, which was slightly too small. They are adequate, Commander. I am here to observe your conflict with the Krill Dominion as part of the Galactic Documentation Initiative. I will need full access to your tactical operations, communication channels, and after-action reports. Morrison nodded slowly. You'll have everything you need. I've assigned Lieutenant Brooks to assist you. She'll make sure you can see whatever you want to see. He paused and something flickered in his eyes. Are there any restrictions on what you can observe? Any Zenthari rules about what's too dangerous or sensitive? Kelthara allowed himself a small expression of superiority. Commander, I have observed over 400 military conflicts across the galaxy. I have witnessed antimatter bombardments, planetary sieges, and fleet actions involving thousands of vessels. Your small border war will present nothing I have not seen before. Brooks and Morrison exchanged a glance. Kelthara noticed Brooks's mouth curve slightly at the corners. Humans called it smiling, though he wasn't certain what it meant in this context. Something about the expression made him Uncomfortable, though he couldn't identify why. Understood, Morrison said. We'll make sure you get the full experience. He activated a holographic display, showing the local star systems. We've been tracking a Krill raiding force that hit 3 mining outposts last week. Our intelligence suggests they'll strike again within 48 hours. You'll be able to observe from that bridge during the engagement. Kelthara made notes. What is your tactical doctrine? Do you employ standard formation warfare or wave assault patterns? Morrison leaned back in his chair. We adapt to the situation. Every engagement is different. Every enemy is different. He smiled, but unlike Brooks's earlier expression, this one held no warmth. The Krill are learning that we don't fight the way they expect. Over the next day, Kelthara toured the Defiant and interviewed crew members. He met Captain Chris Palmer, who commanded the ship's marine contingent. Palmer was a stocky human with scars on his hands and a way of standing that suggested constant readiness for violence. When Kelthara asked about his combat experience, Palmer simply said enough. He observed the pilots in their ready room, listening to their strained conversations. They spoke about something called movies and made references he didn't understand. One pilot, Lieutenant Kyle Bennett, laughed loudly while describing a maneuver he called threading the needle through hell. The other pilots found this amusing. Kelthara found it disturbing. These beings were about to risk their lives, yet they showed no fear, no proper respect for the coming danger. The ship's doctor, Lisa Morgan, gave him a tour of the medical bay. Kelthara noted the primitive surgical equipment and limited regeneration technology. How do you handle mass casualties with such limited resources? He asked. Morgan's face became serious. We prioritize, we improvise, and we don't give up on anyone until there's absolutely no hope left. She touched one of the medical beds gently. Every person matters. Every life is worth fighting for. That evening, Kelthara filed his preliminary report to the Zinthari High Council. He described the human fleet as technologically inferior but adequately organized. He noted their emotional nature and predicted standard warfare patterns. He rated the coming conflict as low intensity, minimal strategic significance. He would later remember that report with deep embarrassment. The alarm sounded at 400 ship time. Kelthara rushed to the bridge, his recording equipment back active. The crew moved with practiced efficiency to their stations. Morrison stood at the center, watching multiple displays simultaneously. Cathar Strike Force detected, Brooks announced. 3 cruisers, 8 frigates, there, approaching the mining station at. Morrison nodded. All ships, this is Defiant actual. Execute pattern chaos theory on my mark. Let's show our observer what human warfare looks like. He glanced at Kelthara. You wanted to see everything. Hold on tight, observer. Class is in session. The fleet moved forward, and Kelthara prepared his instruments. He expected formation combat, logical deployment, patterns, standard tactical doctrine. What he was about to witness would shatter every assumption he held about human warfare and begin a journey that would change his understanding of civilization itself. The battle was 12 minutes away. Kelthara thought he was ready. He had no idea how wrong he was. The human fleet accelerated toward the Krill. Forces in Kelthara activated all his recording systems. He had positioned himself at a secondary observation station on the bridge where he could monitor everything without interfering with the crew. His analysis programs began cataloging ship positions, weapon signatures, and tactical formations. Everything appeared normal for the first 30 seconds. Then the human ships scattered. Kelthara's primary analysis program immediately flagged an error. The fleet broke apart in what appeared to be random directions. There was no formation, no coordinated pattern, no logical deployment structure. His computer tried to identify the tactical doctrine and failed. It tried again, searching through databases of known warfare patterns from 600 documented species. Nothing matched. All ships weapons free, Morrison said calmly. Remember, they're expecting us to fight. Like everyone else, let's disappoint them. The Krill fleet had formed a standard defensive sphere, a textbook formation that protected against concentrated assault. Against any rational enemy, it would have been effective. But the human ships weren't attacking the sphere. They were moving around it, through it, creating angles of fire that should have been to coordinate. Relentless reports engine damage. Brooks announced, monitoring her tactical display. Captain Hayes says he's down to 40%. Thrust. Kelthara noted the damaged vessel, a frigate that was limping toward the Kryn formation. Standard doctrine would have the damaged ship withdraw to a safe distance. Instead, it accelerated directly toward the largest Kryn cruiser. Relentless, this is defiant actual, Morrison said. Greg, what are you doing? The response came through with background noise and what sounded like laughter. I've got an idea. Kelthara watched in horror as the frigate continued its approach. The Kryn cruiser fired repeatedly, scoring hits against the Relentless's failing shields. It was clearly a suicide run, a desperate act by a damaged vessel. The Zentari observer prepared to document the ship's destruction. At the last possible moment, the Relentless fired every thruster on its port side. The ship spun 90 degrees while still maintaining forward momentum. As it rotated, every missile tube opened simultaneously at point-blank range. With the Kryn cruiser's hangar bay fully exposed, the frigate released its entire payload. The Kryn ship's interior explosions were visible through the hangar opening. Secondary detonations rippled through its hull, the Relentless now tumbling from its own maneuver fired stabilization thrusters and somehow managed to avoid the expanding debris field. Relentless, nice shooting, Morrison said, and Kelthara detected approval in his voice. Get that ship to the support carrier for repairs. Copy that. Defiant, Hayes out. Kelthara tried to process what he had witnessed. The maneuver was insane by any tactical standard. The risk of collision, the exposure to enemy fire, the structural stress on a damaged vessel. No rational species would attempt it. Yet it had worked. His attention shifted to the fighter screen. 24 small craft were engaging Kryn interceptors in a swirling chaos that his tracking system struggled to follow. One pilot, Lieutenant Kyle Bennett, flew his fighter in patterns that violated several principles of safe flight. Hangman, you're in the fire zone, Brooks warned. Bennett's pulled back. Bennett's response came through filled with static and what sounded like music. playing in his cockpit. Negative control, I've got a shot on their command ship. Going in. Kelthera watched the small fighter dive through a crossfire of plasma bolts. 3 hit the fighter shields, which collapsed immediately. The craft should have withdrawn. Instead, it accelerated, flying so close to a Kryn frigate that it passed through the ship's shield boundary before the defensive systems could reacquire it. The fighter released 2 torpedoes directly at the Kryn command ship's bridge, then pulled up so sharply that Kelthara's instruments registered gravitational forces that should have killed the pilot. The torpedo struck home, and the Kryn command ship began listing its bridge clearly destroyed. Hangman report, Brooks demanded. I'm good control, Bennett replied, and he was laughing. Somebody better have recorded that. Several other pilots responded with comments that Kelthara's translator struggled to interpret. Phrases like showing off again and lucky idiot seemed contradictory with their tone, which sounded affectionate rather than critical. All ships, they're breaking formation, Brooks announced. Cathar vessels attempting to retreat. Morrison leaned forward. Pursue and disable. No kills unless necessary. We want prisoners for intelligence. The human fleet moved with sudden coordination, cutting off retreat vectors with precision that contradicted their earlier chaos. It was like watching a different fleet entirely. Cathar realized with growing shock that the chaos had been deliberate, a tactic to confuse and destabilize the enemy before switching to coordinated pursuit. During the pursuit, something unusual happened. Morrison activated the ship-wide communication system, and suddenly sound flooded through every speaker. It was music, but unlike any Cathar had encountered. Loud driving with what his translator identified as lyrics about war and survival. Sir, are you playing music during combat? Cathar asked, unable to contain his confusion. Brooks glanced at him with that same slight smile. It's tradition. The commander chooses the battle music. But why? It serves no tactical purpose, doesn't it? Morrison replied, not looking away from his displays. Listen to the calm chatter now. Cathar activated the audio feeds from across the fleet. The crews were singing along with the music between tactical reports. Their voices were louder, more energized. The music seemed to increase their coordination rather than distract them. The battle lasted another 40 minutes. When it ended, 6 Cathar ships had been disabled and boarded. 2 had been destroyed when they refused to surrender. The human fleet had lost 1 destroyer, and the frigate that Hayes commanded was barely functional, but the crew had survived. Cathar spent the next hours observing the aftermath. What he saw disturbed him more than the battle itself. The humans had lost 17 crew members across the fleet. He expected efficient processing of casualties, perhaps a moment of silence. Instead, they held something. Lieutenant Brooks called a wake in the ship's largest common area. The crew gathered together, and someone began telling stories about the deceased. They laughed while tears ran down their faces. They drank alcohol, which impaired cognitive function, yet seemed to help them process their grief. Captain Palmer stood in a corner, and Kelthara watched him punch the metal wall with his closed fist. The impact broke 2 of Palmer's fingers, but he refused to go to medical until every one of his Marines had been treated first. Dr. Morgan moved through the gathering, checking on crew members. Quietly, when she reached Palmer, she examined his hand without comment and placed it in a temporary brace. "You're an idiot, Chris," she said. Softly, "I know," Palmer replied. "But they were my people, Lisa, my responsibility." Kalthara approached Morrison, who stood apart from the group, watching his crew with an expression the observer couldn't read. "Commander, I do not understand this ritual. It seems counterproductive to impair cognitive function during a crisis." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "Observer, we just fought a battle. We lost people who trusted us to bring them home. This isn't about cognitive function. It's about remembering them as people, not just casualties. It's about staying human even when we're at war." "But your grief weakens you," Kalthara insisted. Morrison finally looked at him directly. "No, our grief reminds us why we fight. It reminds us that every person matters. It keeps us from becoming the kind of species that calculates acceptable losses without caring about the loss." He turned back to his crew. "You think emotion makes us weak. Maybe you're right by your standards. But our emotions are what make us strong enough to endure this." Kalthara returned to his quarters and began compiling his observations. He wrote about the chaotic tactics, the unnecessary risks, the emotional responses to casualties. He tried to analyze it through Zinthari frameworks and found every analysis incomplete. These humans fought in ways that defied his understanding of warfare. He sent his second report to the High Council, noting that human warfare was unconventional but effective, and that their emotional responses seemed to enhance unit cohesion rather than degrade it. He recommended continued observation. What Kalthara didn't write was his growing unease. He had observed hundreds of species at war. He had never seen warriors who laughed while flying through fire, who risked everything for tactical advantage, who mourned their dead with such intensity. He had never seen a species that treated war as something both serious and strangely personal. As he prepared for sleep, he heard music still playing somewhere in the ship. Softer now, voices singing together in harmony, and, for the first time in his long career, observer Kalthara wondered if perhaps the Zinthari had lost something important in their evolution toward pure logic. The thought troubled him deeply, and he pushed it away, but it would return stronger each time until he could no longer ignore it. The message arrived 6 days after the first engagement. Kalthara was in the observation bay, reviewing footage from the battle when Lieutenant Brooks entered the room. Her face looked different than he had seen before, harder and colder. "Observer, the commander requests your presence in the briefing room immediately." Something in her tone made Kalthara follow without questions. The corridors were quieter than usual. Crew members moved with purpose, but without the casual conversation he had grown accustomed to hearing. When they entered the briefing room, he found Morrison standing motionless before a large display screen. Captain Palmer sat in a chair, his head in his hands. Dr. Morgan stood against the wall, her arms crossed tightly. "Observer, you should see this," Morrison said quietly. His voice had changed. It was flat, empty of the warmth Kalthara had heard before. "This is what the Kryn sent us 2 hours ago." Kalthara watched footage from what appeared to be a planetary surface. Human colony peaceful and agricultural. Based on the structures, he saw schools, markets, farms, then the perspective shifted to orbit, and he watched Kryn warships descend. What followed made Kalthara's analysis systems flag the content as potentially disturbing. The Kryn didn't just attack military targets, they systematically destroyed civilian areas. The footage showed residential districts burning, children running, people who had no weapons trying to shelter. The Kryn broadcast had labeled it as a warning to humanity. When the footage ended, Kalthara noticed his own recording devices had stopped automatically, their safety protocols triggered by the content. The colony had been called New Providence. 3,000 civilians were dead, most of them families who farmed and taught and lived simple lives far from any military installation. Why would they do this? Kalthara asked. There is no tactical advantage. This violates the galactic conventions on warfare. They did it to send a message, Palmer said without looking up. They think it will make us afraid. They think it will make us negotiate. Morrison finally turned from the display. His face was completely calm, which somehow made it more terrifying. Observer, you're about to see a different kind of human warfare. What you witnessed before was us being professional. What comes next is personal. Over the following hours, Kalthara watched the human fleet transform. The jokes stopped, the music stopped. Crew members moved through their duties with mechanical precision. Lieutenant Brooks worked for 36 continuous hours coordinating with every human military vessel within 5 sectors, refusing to sleep despite Dr. Morgan's orders. Morrison called a fleet-wide assembly, transmitted to all 8 human vessels in the region. Kalthara watched from the bridge as the commander addressed thousands of personnel simultaneously. Morrison spoke quietly, which made every word carry more weight. By now you've all seen what the Kryn did to New Providence, Morrison began. He showed images on every screen. Classroom with small chairs, a market where families had shopped, a hospital that had been specifically targeted. These were not soldiers, these were farmers, teachers, children. They were our people, and they were murdered to frighten us. He paused, and Kalthara saw something dangerous in his eyes. The Kryn made a mistake. They thought attacking civilians would weaken our resolve. What they've actually done is remove our restraint. Morrison's voice dropped even lower. Before, we were fighting a professional military action. Now we're actually angry. The transmission ended, and Kalthara observed the crew's reactions. No one cheered. They simply returned to their stations and began working with an intensity that seemed almost frightening. Commander, what did you mean by removing restraint? Kalthara asked carefully. Brooks answered before Morrison could. We have rules of engagement, observer. Protocols about acceptable force. Civilian safety, proportional response. Those rules exist because we choose to follow them, not because we have to. She looked at Kalthara directly. Kryn just showed us they don't respect those rules, so now we follow only the bare minimum that galactic law requires. Over the next days, the human fleet became something different. They tracked the Kryn forces with patience that contradicted everything Kalthara had seen in the first battle. They cut off supply lines, blocked retreat routes, and position vessels with calculated precision. A Marine sergeant named Lisa Carter told another soldier within Kelthara's hearing, "We were playing before. Game's over." The humans began employing tactics that Kelthara had never encountered. A weapons officer named Danny Hughes managed to hack into Kryn fleet communications. Instead of gathering intelligence, he broadcast a simple message, a countdown from 10 to 1 in the Kryn language, repeating endlessly. Kelthara learned later that the countdown created massive psychological distress among Kryn crews, who began fearing imminent attacks that never came on schedule. Commander Sophie Grant led a fighter squadron that used the debris from previous battles as cover, positioning chunks of destroyed ships along Kryn patrol routes. When Kryn vessels approached, the fighters would emerge from behind the debris at ranges too close for effective defense. It was ambush warfare on a scale Kelthara had only seen in primitive ground conflicts. The most disturbing innovation involved the human use of kinetic weapons, which most species considered obsolete. The humans calculated trajectories for asteroids using small explosives to nudge them into Kryn formation patterns. The Kryn energy shields, designed to deflect plasma and laser fire, were nearly useless against simple rocks, moving at high velocity. When the asteroids hit, they created debris fields that disrupted Kryn formations and made coordinated defense impossible. Captain Palmer prepared his Marines for what he called close quarters combat, boarding actions against Kryn vessels. Kelthara watched them train, and the intensity disturbed him. They practiced fighting in zero gravity, in vacuum, in damaged ships with failing life support. Palmer drove them relentlessly, and Kelthara asked why such extreme preparation was necessary. "Because when we board a Kryn ship, we're going to finish this. We're going to make sure they understand that attacking our civilians was the worst mistake they could have made." Morrison spent hours studying Kryn fleet movements, looking for patterns. He identified a tendency in their command structure to group vessels near support carriers. He began formulating a plan, one that would require using a human ship as bait. Kelthara observed a conversation between Morrison and Captain Nick Davis, commander of the UES Valkyrie. Davis volunteered his ship to act as damaged prey, drawing the Kryn fleet into a trap. The risk was enormous. If the timing failed, the Valkyrie would be destroyed and its crew killed. "Nick, I can't order you to do this," Morrison said. "It's too dangerous." Davis smiled. "You're not ordering, Jake. I'm volunteering. Those people on New Providence deserve justice. If my ship can help deliver it, then that's what we'll do." Every human ship in the sector would converge on a system they designated Anvil Point. The Valkyrie would lead the Kryn fleet, there pretending to flee, while actually guiding them into an ambush. It required perfect timing and coordination. Kelthara sent another report to the Zenthari High Council, but this time he included a warning. Human warfare has escalated beyond standard parameters. Their response to the civilian attack demonstrates capacity for sustained strategic planning combined with emotional motivation. Recommend continued monitoring but increasing caution in assessment. The night before the operation, Kelthara found Morrison alone in his quarters. The commander was reviewing tactical displays, but he looked exhausted. "Commander, may I ask a question?" Morrison gestured for him to continue. "Why does this colony matter so much? In galactic terms, 3,000 lives is a small number. Many species would negotiate rather than escalate." Morrison was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was tired but firm. "Observer, every one of those 3,000 people had a name. They had families, dreams, lives they were building. A child in that classroom was probably learning to read. A farmer was growing food to feed others. A teacher was shaping young minds." He looked at Kelthara directly. "We don't calculate acceptable losses. We don't measure lives against strategic value. They were ours and someone hurt them. That's enough. But the cost of this operation could be higher than 3,000 lives," Kelthara pointed out. "Yes," Morrison agreed, "and every person in this fleet knows that. They volunteered anyway, because if we let this stand, if we show that attacking civilians is acceptable, then more colonies will burn, more children will die. So we stop it here, now, regardless of the cost to ourselves." Kelthara returned to his quarters, but couldn't rest. He reviewed all his observations, trying to understand the pattern. The humans fought with emotion, yet that emotion seemed to make them more dangerous, not less. They mourned their dead intensely, yet that grief drove them to fight harder. They valued individual lives, yet they risked those lives for abstract principles. The Zinthari had evolved past such contradictions. They fought rationally, calculated risks logically, and accepted necessary losses without emotional attachment. Yet watching the humans, Kelthara felt something he had never experienced before. He felt doubt about whether the Centauri way was actually superior. The operation would begin in 8 hours. The entire Krill fleet would either be destroyed or captured, and Kelthara would witness whether human emotion was strength or fatal weakness. He suspected he already knew the answer, and it frightened him more than he wanted to admit. The Valkyrie entered the Anvil Point system, transmitting distress signals that appeared genuine because they were genuine. Captain Davis had deliberately damaged his own ship's shields and vented atmosphere from non-critical sections. To any Krill scanner, the vessel looked like a crippled target limping toward the system's outer planets. Kelthara watched from the Defiance bridge as the Krill fleet took the bait. 32 warships jumped into the system, their commanders eager to finish what they saw as an easy kill. They moved in standard pursuit formation, confident and aggressive. "All ships hold position," Morrison whispered into the fleet channel. "Wait for my mark, stay dark and stay patient." The human fleet hid in the asteroid belt, powered down to minimal signatures, waiting like predators in the shadows. Kelthara had 14 different sensor feeds active. His analysis systems calculated that the Krill had superior numbers and firepower. By logical assessment, the humans should withdraw. They didn't. The Krill fleet closed to weapons range of the Valkyrie, spreading out to surround their target. That was when Morrison gave the order. "All ships, light them up, execute." The asteroid belt came alive with human vessel. They had positioned themselves perfectly, creating a three-dimensional cage around the Kryn fleet. Every escape vector was blocked. The Kryn commanders realized the trap immediately, but they were already committed. What followed was the most intense combat Kelthara had ever witnessed. The Kryn fought with desperation. Knowing they were surrounded, the humans fought with cold precision. Every movement calculated to maximize damage while minimizing their own losses. It was nothing like the chaotic first battle. This was coordinated fury. Lieutenant Brooks coordinated the fleet's movements from the Defiant, her voice never rising, never showing strain. Despite managing 8 different battle groups simultaneously, 2nd Squadron focused fire on their command carrier, 4th Squadron block those frigates from reaching the jump point. Valkyrie, you're clear to maneuver. The Valkyrie's distress signals cut off, and the ship suddenly accelerated, its damaged systems apparently not so damaged after all. Davis had saved his real weapons for this moment, and now his ship added its firepower to the ambush. Captain Palmer's Marines launched boarding actions against 3 Kryn cruisers simultaneously. Kelthara watched the assault through combat cameras mounted on Marine armor. The Marines breached the Kryn hulls with shaped charges, then fought through corridors in conditions that would have killed most species. In one boarding action, Kelthara observed a Marine named Corporal Jake Foster take 4 plasma hits to his armor. The impact should have incapacitated him. Instead, Foster continued fighting, dragging a wounded comrade toward the extraction point. When another Marine asked why he didn't fall back for treatment, Foster's response was simple: "He's one of us, we don't leave people behind." The statement made no tactical sense. The wounded Marine was slowing Foster down, making him vulnerable. Yet every other Marine in the unit was doing the same thing, protecting the wounded even when it exposed them to fire. Kelthara tried to analyze the behavior and couldn't. His databases had no framework for understanding tactical decisions based purely on emotion. Bonds. Commander Morrison personally piloted a fighter when the Defiant's hangar took damage that killed the flight deck crew. Kelthara watched from the bridge as Morrison climbed into the cockpit, something most fleet commanders would never do. "Sir, you can't do this," Brooks protested. "If we lose you, the fleet loses coordination." Morrison checked his flight controls. "Lieutenant, you've been coordinating this fleet for the last hour without my input. You don't need me in the command chair. But those troop carriers need fighter cover, and we're 3 pilots short." He sealed his helmet. "You have the bridge. Try not to crash my ship." Kelthara followed Morrison's fighter through sensor feeds. The commander flew with skill that suggested extensive training, moving through enemy fire to protect vulnerable transport ships carrying Marines. When a Kryn destroyer targeted one of the transports, Morrison positioned his fighter between them, using his own shields to absorb hits that would have destroyed the larger vessel. "Morrison, get clear," Brooks ordered. "Your shields are failing." "Negative. The transport is carrying 200 Marines. I've got this." Kelthara calculated the probability of Morrison's survival at 17%. The commander maintained his position until the transport reached safety, then somehow managed to evade the destroyer's weapons long enough to retreat. His fighter landed with no shields, a damaged engine, and hull breaches in 3 sections. But the most shocking moment came from an unexpected source. Dr. Morgan broadcast a message on all frequencies, including to the Cathar fleet. She announced that the Defiance Medical Bay would accept wounded from any vessel, including Cathar ships, and would treat them according to galactic medical conventions. 3 Cathar vessels surrendered immediately, their commanders stating they would rather face human captivity than continue fighting an enemy who offered medical treatment during active combat. Cathar had never encountered such a tactical development in any of his observations. During the height of the battle, an engineer named Pete Jackson manually vented his entire section's atmosphere to prevent weapon systems from overheating. He sealed himself in an emergency suit and continued operating the weapons, manually exposed to vacuum, while his section of the ship became uninhabitable to save other sections from thermal damage. When Palmer's Marines rescued him 40 minutes later, Jackson's only comment through his suit radio was, "Did the guns keep firing?" When assured they had, he simply nodded and allowed himself to be evacuated for medical treatment. Cathar monitored Cathar communications, something his diplomatic status allowed. He heard growing panic among their commanders. They didn't understand why humans fought this way. The Cathar were a logical species, fighting for territory and resources. They understood tactical withdrawal when odds became unfavorable. But the humans weren't withdrawing. Damaged ships kept fighting, wounded crew members remained at their stations. Units that should have retreated held their positions. One Krill commander was heard saying, "They don't stop. Even when dying, they don't stop." The battle reached its climax when Lieutenant Ryan Clark's fighters suffered catastrophic damage. Kelthara watched through multiple sensor feeds as Clark's cockpit lost pressure and his life support failed. The pilot was dying, his oxygen running out, but he still had control of his fighter's movement. Clark's voice came through on the fleet channel, weak but clear. "This is Hangman. I'm done, but my bird still flies. Anybody need a door opened?" Brooks immediately responded, "Hangman, eject will recover you. Negative control, no time but that. Krill Dreadnought has been causing problems all day." There was a pause, and then Kelthara heard something that would haunt him forever. Clark began singing, his voice growing weaker with each word. The song was about flying away, about going home. He sang off-key and gasped for air between phrases. The dying pilot guided his disintegrating fighter directly toward the Krill Dreadnought's reactor core. The enemy ship's defensive systems destroyed most of Clark's fighter, but momentum and the pilot's final course correction brought what remained of the craft into contact with the reactor shielding. The explosion took 3 seconds to build. When it released, the Dreadnought came apart in sections. 200 human Marines on an assault ship that the Dreadnought had been targeting survived because Clark gave his last moments to save them. The Defiance bridge was completely silent. Then Morrison spoke quietly. "Hangman is down," someone noted in the log. Lieutenant Ryan Clark died saving 200 Marines who he'd never met. They'll know his name. The battle continued for another 2 hours. When it finally ended, the Krill fleet had been destroyed or surrendered, but the human fleet had lost 40% of its vessels and 60% of its personnel. The Defiance bridge operated on emergency power. Half the crew was dead. or wounded, and Morrison had a piece of shrapnel near his spine that Dr. Morgan insisted required immediate surgery. Morrison refused treatment until the battle was completely finished and every wounded crew member had been triaged. He stood on the bridge, his uniform stained with blood from a wound he wouldn't acknowledge, directing rescue operations and coordinating prisoner handling. Kelthara found himself physically ill, a rare occurrence for Zenthari physiology. He had watched beings die for tactical advantage before, but this was different. These humans had died for each other, for principles, for abstract concepts like duty and honor. In the aftermath, Kelthara stood in the observation deck looking at the debris field that had been two fleets. Morrison joined him, moving stiffly from his untreated injury. "Observer, you've been very quiet. I assume you're recording all of this." Kelthara turned to face the commander. "I do not understand your species. You lost so many, you risked everything for what? For revenge, for pride." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, staring at the stars. "No, for the principle that attacking civilians is unacceptable, for the idea that every life matters, for the belief that if good people don't stand up to evil, then evil wins." He looked at Kelthara. "Those people on New Providence deserve someone to care enough to make this cost something. But you lost more people than died on New Providence," Kelthara pointed out. "Yes, and every one of them chose to be here. They knew the odds. They came anyway." Morrison touched the viewport gently. "That's what you don't understand about humans, observer. We fight for each other. We fight for the belief that some things matter more than survival." Kelthara realized in that moment that he had been fundamentally wrong about humanity. Their emotional nature wasn't a weakness to be overcome. It was a weapon they wielded with devastating effect. They had mastered their emotions, channeling grief into determination, love into sacrifice, and anger into focused action. "I need to update my report," Kelthara said quietly. Morrison nodded. "Make sure you tell them the truth. Tell them what humans are really capable of when we stop being polite." As Kelthara returned to his quarters to file his report, he understood that everything was about to change. The galaxy thought humanity was primitive. They had no idea what was really coming. Kelthara stood before the Zenthari High Council, 300 of the most powerful and ancient beings in the galaxy. The chamber was enormous, designed to display the Zenthari's technological superiority, with walls that showed distant stars and floors that seemed to float in space. Normally, Kelthara would have felt honored to present here. Today, he felt only urgency and a strange emotion he had never experienced before: fear. The council leader, High Arbiter Vintok, gestured for him to begin. "Observer Kelthara, your request for emergency session was highly irregular. Your preliminary reports suggested a minor border conflict. What has changed?" Kelthara activated his recording devices, and the chamber's displays filled with footage from the battles. "Honored Council, I was sent to observe humans at war. I believed I would document another primitive species engaging in predictable violence. I was catastrophically wrong." He showed them the first battle, the chaotic tactics, the impossible maneuvers, then the footage from Anvil Point. The council members watched in silence as Ryan Clark sang his dying song and flew his fighter into the dreadnought. They watched Jake Foster drag his wounded comrade through enemy fire. They watched Morrison pilot a fighter while commanding a fleet. What you are seeing, Kelthara explained, is not primitive warfare. This is something we have never encountered. The humans are technologically inferior to us by centuries. Their lifespans are brief, their bodies are fragile, but they possess something we lost long ago in our evolution toward logic. And what is that? Vintok asked. An unlimited capacity for determination, an ability to transform emotion into tactical advantage, a willingness to die for abstract concepts that cannot be measured or they have weaponized their capacity to care. He showed them more footage. Dr. Morgan treating Karen prisoners while her ship burned, Lieutenant Brooks working 36 hours without rest, Captain Palmer refusing medical treatment until his Marines were cared for. Every example demonstrated humans prioritizing others over themselves, sacrificing personal safety for collective goals. They form bonds that transcend tactical logic. Kelthara continued, a human commander will risk an entire operation to save one soldier because abandoning that soldier would damage the trust that makes their units effective. They create meaning in suffering, which allows them to endure conditions that would break other species. Council Member Threnel spoke up, surely their emotional nature makes them unstable, unpredictable. Yes, Kelthara agreed, and that unpredictability is their greatest strength. The Karen could not model their tactics because human tactics adapt to emotion, circumstance, and individual initiative. A Zentari fleet would never attempt what the Valkyrie did because the risk was too high. But humans factor in trust, courage, and determination in ways our computers cannot calculate. He showed them footage from human ships, Marines who painted symbols on their armor, pilots who named their fighters, engineers who spoke to their machines as if they were alive, crews who held ceremonies to honor their dead and sang songs during battle. Every one of these behaviors seems illogical, Kelthara said, yet each one serves a purpose. The symbols build identity and belonging. The names create emotional bonds with equipment, making operators more careful and effective. The ceremonies process grief and strengthen resolve. The music synchronizes crews and elevates morale. Ventok leaned forward. Observer, you seem disturbed by this. You have witnessed war before. Kelthara was quiet for a moment. Honored Arbiter, I have observed 400 military conflicts. I have seen species fight for territory, resources, survival. I have never seen a species fight for principles. I watched a human die singing while saving people he had never met. I watched a commander refuse medical treatment because his subordinates came first. I watched an entire fleet risk destruction to punish an attack on civilians who had no strategic value. He activated one final recording. It showed his conversation with Morrison in the observation deck after the battle. The council listened as Morrison explained why humans fought, why they sacrificed, why they refused to calculate acceptable losses. This species, Kelthara said carefully, is dangerous in ways we have never encountered, not because they are strong, but because they are relentless. They do not quit, they do not surrender. They do not accept defeat as long as any other option exists. You are suggesting we should fear them? Thrinal asked skeptically. I am suggesting we should understand them before we ever become their enemy. Kelthara brought up tactical analysis. The humans defeated a Kryn fleet that outnumbered them. They did so with inferior technology, shorter lifespans, and fragile biology. They won because they were willing to pay costs that no logical species would. Except he showed casualty figures. They lost 60% of their personnel in the final battle. Most species would have negotiated or withdrawn at half those losses. The humans fought until the enemy was completely defeated, accepting casualties that should have broken their morale. He paused, but their morale never broke. In fact, witnessing their comrades' sacrifices seemed to make the survivors fight harder. He paused again, but their morale never broke. In fact, witnessing their comrades' sacrifices seemed to make the survivors fight harder. Council member Zoref spoke for the first time. What do you recommend, Observer? Kelthara had prepared for this question. I recommend immediate diplomatic alliance with humanity. We should offer technology exchange, mutual defense treaties, and cultural exchange programs. We should do this not because we need them currently, but because if we do not, we will eventually face a choice between becoming their ally, their enemy, or their conquered. The council chamber erupted in protests. Several members spoke at once, arguing that Kelthara had been compromised, that he was overreacting, that humanity was too primitive to pose any threat. Kelthara raised his voice for the first time in the session. Honored council, please listen. The humans have a saying, do not mistake kindness for weakness. They are kind. Dr. Morgan treated enemy wounded during battle. Commander Morrison offers honorable terms to defeated enemies. They follow rules of warfare, even when their opponents do not. He brought up footage of the Krill attack on New Providence again. But when their kindness is betrayed, when their civilians are targeted, when their principles are violated, they become something else entirely. They removed their restraint. They stopped fighting like professionals and started fighting like humans who were personally offended. And that is different. How? Dintok asked. Because professional warriors calculate risk and reward. Personally offended humans calculate only victory and cost, and they are willing to pay any cost. Kelthara showed the final moments of Ryan Clark. This pilot had seconds to live. He could have ejected, could have died peacefully. Instead, he used his last breath to destroy an enemy ship and save Marines he would never meet. That is not professional warfare. That is warfare motivated by love for his species and hatred for their enemies. The council was silent now. Kelthara continued. Humanity's technological inferiority is temporary. They learn quickly and adapt faster. But their emotional nature is permanent. They will never evolve past caring deeply, fighting fiercely, and refusing to abandon their principles. In 500 years, they will have technology equal to ours. In 1,000 years, they may surpass us. But they will still fight with the same determination that let them defeat the Kryn. He brought up a final analysis. Every species in the galaxy fights to survive. Humans fight to matter. They fight for meaning, for honor, for principles that cannot be touched or measured. And because those things are more important to them than survival, they are willing to pay prices that make survival-focused species withdraw. Dentok studied the data carefully. You truly believe they pose a threat to the Centauri? Kelthara replied, I believe they pose a choice. We can befriend them now while they still remember we were neutral observers. During their war, we can offer genuine alliance and benefit from their unique strength, or we can dismiss them as primitive, and in 500 years, when they are our technological equals, we can explain to them why we stood aside during their conflicts. And if they become enemies, Threnal asked. Kelthara showed footage one more time. Morrison flying a fighter while commanding a fleet, Palmer protecting his Marines with broken fingers. Clark singing as he died, Foster carrying wounded through fire, Brooks coordinating 8 battle groups without sleep. Then we will face warriors who fight for each other with bonds we cannot break, who sacrifice for principles we cannot corrupt, who endure suffering we cannot inflict, who never surrender while any option remains. He looked at each council member. Honored council, I have observed hundreds of species at war. I have never been afraid before. I am afraid now, not because humans are cruel or violent, but because they are impossibly determined, and their determination is powered by love for each other. The vote took 3 hours. In the end, the Council decided by narrow margin to authorize diplomatic contact with humanity, technology exchange on limited basis, and mutual defense discussions. The final provision was added almost as an afterthought. Under no circumstances should any Centauri action ever target human civilian populations. Kelthara had pushed for that provision. Specifically, he had explained what happened when someone hurt human civilians. The council understood. After the session, Ventok approached Kelthara privately. You have changed, observer. You were always logical, detached. Now you speak with emotion about this species. Yes. Kelthara admitted, I have changed. I watched beings die for principles I did not understand. I watched them sacrifice for each other in ways that defied logic. And I realized that perhaps logic is not the only path to civilization. Perhaps emotion, properly mastered, is not weakness but strength. You are requesting reassignment to the human diplomatic mission. Yes, honored arbiter. I need to understand them better, and I believe the Centauri needs someone who understands both our logic and their passion to build this alliance properly. Then Talk was quiet for a moment. Do you truly believe they will chain the galaxy? Kelthara thought about Morrison's words in the observation deck, about the way humans fought not just to survive but to matter, about their willingness to sacrifice for principles that other species had abandoned. I believe they already have, honored arbiter. The galaxy just does not know it yet. 6 months later, Kelthara returned to human space as the first Centauri ambassador. Admiral Morrison greeted him aboard the rebuilt Defiant with warmth and genuine pleasure. They shared a drink in the Admiral's quarters, and Kelthara tried human alcohol for the first time. It burned his throat and made his head feel strained. You know, Morrison said, you could have stayed home, sent reports from distance. Why come back? Kelthara considered the question carefully. Because I saw your people at their Worst and best. I saw what you are capable of when tested, and I realized the galaxy faces a choice. Understand humanity, or eventually be changed by humanity, whether we understand or not. I prefer to understand. Morrison laughed, then became serious. We don't want to change anyone, Kelthara. We just want to live our lives, protect our people, and maybe make some friends. That, Kelthara replied, is what makes you truly terrifying, Admiral. You mean it? He looked out at human space, at colonies rebuilding and ships patrolling, at a species that refused to be defined by others' expectations. He thought about his report, the one that would spread through the galaxy over the coming years. The title was simple: Humanity First. Contact Warfare Assessment and Warning. The content was simpler. They will not quit ever, under any circumstances. Plan accordingly. Kelthara had come to observe humans at war. He had stayed to learn from them, and perhaps in time to help his people understand that civilization was not about abandoning emotion, but about mastering it. The humans had mastered their emotions long ago. They just chose to wield them rather than suppress them, and that made all the difference. As Kelthara began his work as ambassador, he sent one final personal message to Ventak. It contained only 5 words, but they summarized everything he had learned. Never make humans personally angry. The Council would understand. Eventually, the entire galaxy would understand. Kelthara just hoped they learned before making the same mistake the Kryn had made, because he had seen what happened when humans stopped being polite, and he never wanted to see it again.